we've imported some very dangerous people, some violent men from violent places, and instead of requiring them to assimilate to the values of the settled population, we've told everyone else that we have to adapt to the intolerant newcomers. And hence, for example, we've now had 2 cases of people being arrested for burning Qurans. Now, honestly, I can't see why anyone would want to burn a Quran. I think it's an oafish and obnoxious thing to do, but it's not an illegal thing to do. And do
you think someone would be arrested for burning the Bible here?
It's very difficult to imagine it, right? Because what's happened is that, in effect, the kind of DEI training of the police is now taking precedent over parliamentary statute, because there's no law that says you can't destroy your own private property, right? So there's no legal basis for this. It's a very tendentious interpretation of public order. But what it really is that we have sacralized the hurt feelings of certain protected groups, even when, as in this case, some of the people offended are themselves deeply intolerant.
All right, so what are you making of the ARC conference?
It's wonderful to have all these people. It's wonderful to have a celebration of free speech, right? We've been boiled like a frog. It's been like the lockdowns, you know.
You guys are really getting boiled, yeah.
Right, and it's quite refreshing, a bit like at J.D. Vance's speech in Munich, right? It's quite refreshing just to have somebody setting out quite how far we've come. And you're thinking, hang on, when did we agree to this? When was there ever a national debate where we agreed to limit speech because we've elevated, above every other goal of policy, the imagined sensitivities of certain protected groups?
So what is going on in this country as it pertains to free speech? You know, we see the videos on Twitter of police showing up at doors because people posted memes and things like that. And from an American perspective, sometimes I see these videos and I don't share them immediately because I'm like, this can't be real. And yet it's been a big theme here.
See, I think the American perspective has really helped here. The poet Burns has that famous line, "Would some power the gifty gie us to see ourselves as ever see us," right? It's when people see the shock that is being caused by literally people being sent to prison for saying nasty things online at the same time that violent criminals are being released to free up space for them, that they think, wait a minute, you know, this isn't just about being kind. This isn't just about being sensitive. We've become a much more authoritarian society. You know, we went through the Second World War. We went through the Cold War, believing that freedom and free speech and free association set us apart from the other side. And then having won, we've thrown it all out of the window.
So as a British conservative, one of the things in my 48 hours here has been that a lot of the conversations have been around people saying they want the conservatives to be better. I think there's a lot of conservatives here or old school liberals here that usually vote conservative, let's say, and they just don't think the conservatives are doing enough. Well, what do you make of that critique?
Well, I mean, look, we could all be better, right? I mean, that should be a standard aspiration at all times. But it is always difficult for a party to struggle with things that are in the past. If people say, I'm not going to vote for you because of what your party did 10 years ago, you can't change that. Right? You can only protest that you're different. Imagine if people have said, I'm never going to vote for that woman Thatcher because of what Edward Heath did, right? I'm never going to vote for Reagan because of Ford. I mean, it's actually a slightly odd way of thinking, and yet it's a very natural way for people to respond. And so I think we just need to show that the failures of the past government are associated with the people of the past government, and we've moved on.
So immigration seems to be the big one here and across Europe. What is the conservative position on immigration, and do you think that it will attract enough people to make the party bigger?
Well, there has been too much too quickly. And as a result, we've imported some very dangerous people, some violent men from violent places. And instead of requiring them to assimilate to the values of the settled population, we've told everyone else that we have to adapt to the intolerant newcomers. And hence, for example, we've now had 2 cases of people being arrested for burning Qurans. Now, honestly, I can't see why anyone would want to burn a Quran. I think it's an oafish and obnoxious thing to do, but it's not an illegal thing to do. And
Do you think someone would be arrested for burning the Bible here?
It's very difficult to imagine it, right? Because what's happened is that, in effect, the kind of DEI training of the police is now taking precedent over parliamentary statute, because there's no law that says you can't destroy your own private property, right? Mm-hmm. So there's no legal basis for this. It's a very tendentious interpretation of public order. But what it really is that we have sacralized the hurt feelings of certain protected groups, even when, as in this case, some of the people offended are themselves deeply intolerant. So I was astonished by that case in Sweden, where somebody burnt a Quran, was murdered, right? Was murdered by extremists, and the response of the authorities was to say, "Let's stop this Quran burning." Right? If we don't offend these cry bullies in the first place, then maybe they won't have to murder you.
Do you think Europe can get out of this problem? Because obviously it's not just in your borders, it's in Sweden, it's in many of these other countries. We've been through Charlie Hebdo already and seen sort of the reverse reaction that you would have thought the liberals would have stood up for free speech, etc. But so you do believe.
I'm much more optimistic. Not really about, so the problem with liberals in every sense, both in the American and in the classical sense, is that they saw this primarily as a racial issue. So people who would have normally been very, very strongly for secularism and secularization, because religious minorities happened not to be white in large part, threw all of their normal assumptions aside and approached it in terms of race relations. But the good news, and this is very, very rarely reported either here or in the US, is the extent to which there is a backlash within those communities. I was in the European Parliament for 21 years. I had several 100,000, mainly Pakistani Kashmiri constituents. Their single biggest complaint as Muslims, right? I mean, they had the same complaints as everyone else about healthcare and whatever. But when they were talking as Muslims, the single biggest complaint they had was the way these kind of bearded weirdos were held up as representative of their community. Mm-hmm. And I think it's. I think.
Well, what can be done about that? I mean, that has to come from their community,
right? But also, the rest of us can give a lead, right? The government needs to be very, very clear. And when I say the government, I mean local government, schools, the whole institution, the apparatus of the state needs to be much clearer about saying we will support you if you are against this kind of extremism. We will support the decent heads of families who are trying to prevent their kids falling into strange ways. I mean, this isn't really new for us, David. If you go back 100 years, 80% of British subjects were neither white nor Christian. Right? In the two great wars of the 20th century, millions of non-white and non-Christian young men volunteered to fight, crossing half the world to take up arms for a country they'd never set foot in many cases, right? Because they believed in the values that elevated our civilization, including free speech, free contract, free association, all the rest of it, right? What's changed? What is it that we've taught their grandchildren? Yeah. Well, if their grandchildren or great-grandchildren got any history at all in school, it was presented to them as a hateful chronicle of racism and exploitation. So is it any wonder that some of them respond to the education they've had? Right? It's because we have lost confidence in our values. And that's why I think this is a soluble problem. But the first step is recovering our self-belief.
Why do you think that the UK seemingly has been unable to defend those incredible principles? Is it just because the liberals thought of this as a racial argument and not a sort of civilizational struggle or something else? Were there any other pieces there?
So I think that's the single biggest thing. Anti-racism became like a religious value. But don't underestimate, as this interview is demonstrating, the extent to which the US and the rest of the Anglosphere are a single cultural space. We imported some terrible ideas from some liberal colleges in the US. The BLM movement got, I think somebody worked out, 28 times more coverage on the BBC than the rape gangs in the Northern English cities.
And then you were having BLM protests in London where your police don't even have guns.
Right. White British BLM protesters shouting, "Hands up, don't shoot," right? And unarmed metropolitan cops, right? And but not just that. I blame the West Wing for this, right? We all think all politicos here think that they're Americans. You hear these bizarre phrases being used. We see the whole racial issue through basically an American prism. Right? Even down to the fact that it was BLM. Black people are not our main racial minority here. It's 4% of our population, right? The South Asian people are a much bigger minority. But we think that Selma and segregation was somehow our story. So if you're a white conservative, they call you a Klansman. If you're a black conservative, they call you apart from being unbelievably rude, what's any of this got to do with us, right? But the good news is that just as the terrible ideas spilled out from the US and infected Canada, Australia, and Britain much more badly than the rest of the world, so I think that the backlash is also part of that single cultural space. I say the rest of the world kind of adapted it, right? In Canada, it took the form of the pretended Indigenous genocide and the kids in the boarding schools. In Australia, it took the form of the Indigenous voice to Parliament. In Britain, we just pretended that we were part of, we pretended we were in Mississippi, right?
Right. Crazy.
And conducted. Now, there comes a moment with all of these moral panics when the sensible people just shake their heads and wake up and say, hang on, wait a minute. You're saying what? Hey, how is this helpful? And a thing that always really bothered me during the British BLM moment, nobody thought about the impact it was having on black British kids growing up. Imagine that you're a small child, maybe preschool. You're just kind of catching this on the news at the periphery of your vision. You don't really understand what it is. But you would grow up thinking that the police are going to shoot at someone who looks like you. And we've imported this for no benefit at all. We treat black British people as like props in somebody else's story, in a story that's fundamentally aimed at guilty white people, right? And nobody stopped to think, what is the impact? I mean, if you were trying to create mental health problems...
Unless they were doing exactly what they were trying to do, which...
I think that credits them with too much strategic intelligence. I think this was just fashion, right? And my youngest was 4 years old. He had a couple of black friends at school. Whenever I was watching this stuff on TV, I was thinking, how does it, if you're trying to induce anxiety and depression in someone, you tell them that it doesn't matter what they do, that they're doomed because everyone is out to get them. Like it's the opposite of behavioral therapy, isn't it? Right?
Yeah.
And yet we were doing this in this kind of self-indulgent spasm.
Let me ask you from a British perspective on what's going on in America right now. My sense for most of the people here is that everyone's kind of thrilled with what's happening in America for the last month. What's your take?
I mean, look, yes and no, right? So I love the deregulation. I love the Doge. I think Elon Musk is great. I've got to say, I'm not wild about making territorial claims on other NATO countries, right? The international order has rested on the idea that you don't change borders by force.
What do you think of the general concept of let the countries pay their fair share?
I agree with that.
Not have America free the bill, yeah.
And I've argued that for a long time. But it's very difficult to condemn a Chinese attack on Taiwan or a Putinite attack on Ukraine if at the same time you're claiming Panama or Greenland, right? Sure. The principles that we have taken for granted, that you and I have grown up with and that we've taken for granted, had a particular birth, right? They came from a time and place. They came from the Atlantic Charter, from Newfoundland in 1941. And the idea that you should peacefully arbitrate disputes, although it's been flouted, has never been jettisoned until now. And that really does worry me.
Any final thoughts or any other expectations for the conference for the next day or so?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that I'm very keen on and which I hope comes out. One underexplored opportunity that we have, Britain having left the EU and now Biden being out, is a closer trade relationship between our two countries. I detect that this is something that the president wants. We actually got quite far with it until 2020 when Biden stopped all trade talks. And we then, COVID came along. But I think there is now an opportunity to pick up from where we were. No two countries are more economically compatible. 1 million Brits every day turn up to work for American-owned companies. 1 million Americans every day clock into work for British-owned companies. You are our biggest investor. We are your biggest investor. What hasn't followed until now has been the trade, because for the last 50 years, our trade was controlled by the European Union. We now have the opportunity to create a larger market among compatible civilizations with fairly similar GDP. We're not going to have a brain drain in either direction. And it is a lever-marked growth that works for both countries and has really no downside at all. So I think this is one of the things that we could really profitably get out of this administration.
We shall see. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. Very nice to be here, David.
If you're looking for more eye-opening and worldly conversations, make sure to dive into our international playlist. And if you want to watch full interviews on a wide variety of topics, watch our full episode playlist, all right over here. And to get notified of all future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell.